Welcome everybody to the Germination Station, sponsored by Nowaki. You can find them in the home fields. They've got lots of lovely stuff. Thank you so much for coming to the Yo Valley Organic Garden Festival. How exciting, first ever one. And this is the first talk in the Germination Station. We have got a whole day's worth of treats lined up for you. First of all, we have got Sophie Pavelle in conversation with Clare Foster. Sophie is a zoologist, a science communicator, a podcaster, a writer, an award-winning writer, no less, for her first book, Forget Me Not, and her second book, To Have or to Hold, is available now. She and Clare will be talking a lot about that book. Clare herself is an author of multiple books, the most recent being Pastoral Gardens, which is gorgeous. Go and have a look, check it out. She is also garden editor at House and Garden. There will be a short amount of time for questions at the end, and Josie will be going through the crowd. Put your hands up and she will be around with a roving mic. So without further ado, over to Clare and Sophie. Here they are.
Hello everyone, lovely to see you here today, and I'm very excited to be here at this first Yo Valley Organic Garden Festival because it's just a great thing, and I hope it's the first of many. And I'm really excited to be talking to Sophie today. And I'll be honest, I've only just come across Sophie's writing, but I'm really pleased I did. I think it's kind of catapulted me into a whole new world. I've always been a nature lover. I've always had that connection with nature. And obviously I'm a gardener. And so I know a certain amount about garden birds. I know about the pollinators. I know about the incredible life in the soil. In fact, I did write a book about compost a long time ago, which I'm quite proud of. But I didn't know about half the things, any of the things that Sophie mentions in her book. So these stories that she tells so vividly are designed, I think, to surprise, to shock, and sometimes to even disgust people, which I think we might get onto during the course of this conversation. But they're also designed to make people really sit up and think about their surroundings, think about their environment. And I think her stories are designed to really make people connect and perhaps therefore to be more likely to care about their environment enough to do something collectively about climate change. So I want to ask Sophie first how she got into this, and I'm just fascinated to know whether this love of nature comes from your childhood.
Thank you, Claire. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and turning up on a Thursday. It's very nice to see you all. I'm aware we haven't actually got that long to talk, so I'm going to try and keep my answers nice and succinct. But I think the love of nature, the love of the outdoors, the love of adventure did come from childhood. I was very lucky to grow up in Devon, and our parents were very keen on getting us to get out on Dartmoor and Woodbury Common and into the woods, whatever the weather. And we were very lucky to grow up on the Exe estuary, and so suddenly the whole world of like an intertidal zone was on our doorstep, and I think that was so captivating for young children, and it obviously still is for many. And so I feel very grateful that my world was, nature was so accessible to me at such a young age. And I never really knew what I wanted to do when I grew up, but I always knew that I wanted nature to feature in some part of it. I was never really keen on IDing species or being really nerdy about it. It was more an experiential kind of thrill of the chase, being outside, kind of thing. And I just knew that that made me feel good. And I think that's why we're all here today in many ways, is because we know that being green-fingered and being outside makes us feel good and can translate into such powerful action for nature. So I studied zoology not far from here at the University of Bristol. And then I went on to do a master's, still in Bristol, in science communication. And so that really helped me develop a fascination and I think an interest in the challenge and the act of translation when you've got science and things happening in the laboratory or out in the field, but then translating its significance in a way that can help anyone understand. So whether that's through the medium of radio or podcasting, writing, film. And I really love that blend of art and science, and I hadn't really encountered that before. And obviously now we live in a time where that act of translation and cutting through the noise with what's really important is more important than ever before. So writing books was not part of my plan, but it's one of those curveballs that came along, and I decided to run with it and see what happened.
Well, I think if you haven't read one of Sophie's books, then I really recommend it. She writes in such a kind of engaging way and makes everything very, very complex subjects very accessible. So we're going to be talking today about Sophie's most recent book, To Have and to Hold. And I think we've got a short clip, haven't we, to play just to start things off.
Yeah, so this is a little film that I worked on with an amazing film production company that kind of teases the world of the book. So hopefully you can all see it, and hopefully my button pressing works. Is that right? Can you do it from your end, maybe? It worked brilliantly when we practiced, of course.
If you were to imagine a book about relationships, what's the story? Boy meets girl, they fall in love, fight, make up, they live happily ever after. But what about all the wilder, weirder, darker relationships that defy every label right under our nose? In To Have or to Hold, I investigate nature's hidden relationships, how life lives together in symbiosis, finding it to be no accident, but strategic, glamorous and grotesque. Symbiosis binds the world, changes how we see it. As the climate holds Earth in a vice, I'm curious, are these ancient relationships secure? For me, writing is running, is riding, is moving. You travel, you listen, you observe. You get aches and pains and feel delirious and fearful. I dream of worms and fungi, and sunfish and sentences form knots in my head. When I was writing, I had these cravings to be underwater, wanting to give myself to nature, to write about her as she must be written. Through symbiosis, we are part of the story. I guess that's the message of this book. Nothing exists in isolation. You are never alone.
That's brilliant. How did you come to want to write about symbiosis and this very specific subject?
Well, I have always been fascinated by the things that gross people out. And I think I came to that realization when I was at university. And I was lucky enough to have some of the leading parasitologists be our lecturers during the zoology course. And so we did modules in parasitology and then also social insect behavior, through which symbiosis, which is the kind of the stunning situation where completely different species have evolved to tangle their lives together in order to survive. And parasitology and parasitism is the dominant form of that evolutionary situation. And parasitism involves, as a lot of us probably know, the suffering of one species to aid the survival of another. And I just became fascinated at how ancient these strategies were, but then how astonishing and sustainable they are. So they've come up with these very complex, very, in some cases, horrifying strategies to survive and kind of siphon the resources from one species. But the host stays alive and in some cases actually survives and reproduces on its own. And I was like, well, actually, how can that exploitation be so sustainable to mean that parasitism is the life strategy for over half of all animal life? And so that's a huge amount of the world and the living world that I think we are so ready to ignore and shun and be disgusted by, but actually is can be an incredible conservation ally, especially when we're looking at, I'm sure many of you being gardeners are aware of different parasites, and they have a very complicated but very overlooked story. And so I felt, essentially, if we're talking about the relationships that exist in the natural world, that kind of opened up an opportunity to really interrogate our relationship with the natural world at a time where it feels turbulent, but also full of many opportunities. And so, I was just keen to get into that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by several stories in this book, and there really is the yuck factor. I mean, you talk about a parasite on the sunfish as big as your thumb, and then I got sucked into looking at videos of hairworms in crickets, and it was, truly disgusting but fascinating as well. And I think, it really makes you look at nature and behold it in a different way. How did you choose which creatures or plants to focus on in the book?
So there were several things on my list of criteria that I wanted to tick off. I wanted species who would take me all over the British Isles. So the underpinning narrative is a travelogue, travelling all over the British Isles from England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Channel Islands, to try and find some of these relationships in the wild and try and experience just a fraction of the elements and the environmental challenges and the hazards and the opportunities that they deal with every single day and have done for millions of years. And I like to make it challenging for myself. I try and do it by low-carbon travel, so ferries, trains, cycling, hiking, everything. But again, I think that helps me translate nature better onto the page if I've almost pushed myself through it. And I just really enjoy that kind of adventure travel aspect of it. So I want a species who would take me to different environments in those corners. So we've got temperate rainforests, we've got ancient chalk grasslands, we've got aspen forests, we've got intertidal zones in Jersey, and kind of quiet heathlands back home in Devon. And I want a species that would feature a whole range from the animal, plant, and fungi kingdom, so to try and give a breadth of the biodiversity that's on offer here, but also species whose stories would allow me to talk about wider things like the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and also hopefully be some species who you've never encountered before, to try and help us look again and rekindle that natural awe and wonder that we all have, that's so easily lost in the noise of everything and the doom and gloom of all the headlines, and almost start again with our own relationship.
Yeah. I particularly like the chapter on the Queen of the Woods, the lichens, because I go to an area of North Wales where there are just some amazing temperate rainforests. And you, I mean, this is an incredibly complex relationship. I just wonder whether you could read a little snippet from your book, the description of the lungwort.
Yeah, so lungwort is unique in the whole of the natural world in that it survives only with the participation of 3 organisms. If any one of those organisms dies or drops off or leaves, the whole of the lungwort lichen dies. So for some species, death is the gateway to symbiosis. For others, death is the nail in the coffin. And so for this chapter, I went to the south coast of Ireland, temperate rainforest, and had a wonderful, happy, quite wet time stomping around in the rainforest. So this is a little description of lungwort. If lungwort's lobes were a baroque petticoat, a 5-hoop skirt would have been required to lift her more developed lobes into their 3D array. Lungwort demands the sun, although a plant she is absolutely not. Growing on the vertical, diagonal, and perpendicular to catch the drops falling around her. The Japanese call this komorebi, the way the sunlight falls through the trees. Her texture was vascular, her thallus raised in a network of vein-like streams, rivers, estuaries, and channels radiating across her green body. Veins like those across my lungs, holding her fast, yet loose enough against oak. Isn't she a beauty? Claire breathed next to me. Claire was one of the many experts I feature in the book. Through a hand lens, I saw lush mountains, ridges, hollows, valleys, and vast plains. Sweeping up and left, I spied settlements, apotheca, the fungal spore factories. Their deep red colour told us this lungwort was more than 16 years old, a reigning queen in a hyper-oceanic kingdom. I'll leave it there.
So you can see, I mean, it's really beautiful. The way Sophie describes these things it's really beautiful. I was really struck by the kind of all-consuming passion of some of the experts that you've obviously met. Was there one person in particular who you remember and are really fond of?
Yeah, so as you said, I was very lucky to meet some of the world-leading experts on some of these species, but then also symbiosis as a whole evolutionary discipline. And I met this one guy, Xavier Bay, Dr. Xavier Bay, who's based in Brittany. He's French, amazing, completely mad as a hatter. But I met him just at the right time where he totally destabilized my whole vision for this book, which was at the time slightly unsettling and unhelpful, but then actually in hindsight was the best conversation I've ever had. And so I thought instead of me waffling on, I picked a reading that gives you hopefully a bit of a glimmer as to what an amazing character he was. And just as a further bit of background, I first came across him on a TED Talk online where he was talking about this species of worm called the mint sauce worm, because it's the colour of mint sauce that you have with your roast dinner. But it's a creature who has decided they don't just want to be an animal, they would also quite like to be a plant. And so they've decided to be both, and they're called a plant-animal worm. So it's an example of symbiosis breeding spectacular hybrids of life that you would just never even dream of. And Xavier simply said, I think at either the beginning or the end of this talk, that he said, "This little worm makes me dream." And I was like, what an amazing thing for a really high-end academic to speak so wistfully and whimsically about nature. So here he is. For Xavier, terminology matters when talking about the intimacies between different species. I don't like to use the word, I'm not going to do a French accent, by the way, I might offend. I don't like to use the word exchange. Why? Because it implies compensation, a deal based on a former discussion or commitment. I like to talk of transfers between species as it describes relationships in flux. Species come together without intention. We must remember this. In nature, exploitation and inequality don't mean a loss of balance. It's not good versus bad, Xavier cautioned. This is just a world of relationships, driven by the environment, driven by change. He giggled. If you want harmony, you must admit some things and refuse others. A kind of tolerance, else you will be eaten. And I had flashbacks to pre-marriage counselling.
So again, you can see that Sophie introduces us to these characters. So it's not just about the nature in the book, it's about these people as well. And these people are so passionate about what they do, and their expertise is so narrow, but they're just absolutely fascinating. How long did it take you to put this book together? Because you're obviously going out, finding these people, doing all that research, and then having to come back and sit down and actually write. Is the writing discipline difficult for you?
The writing part is I don't want to say easy by any means. This is the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's a bit like painting and decorating. It's the prep that takes the longest. The doing the frog tape, the sanding, the everything is painful. And so for me, the prep was finding these experts, lining up interviews, speaking to them sometimes for hours, hand transcribing these interviews, because you can get AI to do it for you, but then it strips all the colour out of their personality, and I want to know what their expression was when they delivered a piece of information, whether they sighed, whether they laughed, whether they giggled like Xavier did. And so I sort of painstakingly did that, but I also loved doing that process. And then, of got the expeditions and the travels and making all of the notes there, and then my own research. So every chapter was like a whole building project of bringing in all these different things, and it felt a bit like engineering. And then the writing is kind of the cement that binds all of those bricks together. So I love that whole process, and it is very draining, but I did it in a year whilst working, and then also I got married halfway through. I'm not sure I would repeat the intensity again. It was difficult, but I think this book was on my brain for several months, then in earnest in a year, and then it's about a year of production to turn it from a Microsoft Word document into something like this.
Oh, fantastic. I just want to go back to specifics. Another chapter in the book that I absolutely loved. As a gardener, kind of in tune with plants and pollinators, I love the chapter on the bee and the spider orchid. And I've always been fascinated by orchids and never quite sure about why they grow in some places and why not in others, and the fact that they need a certain fungi or mycorrhizae in the soil to actually germinate. But you kind of explained that in the book, and I just wonder whether you could read the passage in the book about why this bee actually mistakes this orchid for a female bee.
Okay, sure. So the early spider orchid, as with many orchids, has evolved cunning methods of disguise and deceit. And this is all because they just want to be pollinated by a specific bee, which is in this case the buffish mining bee, which is a solitary bee. The bee can go to other flowers. It's not specifically relying on the orchid, but the bee is everything to this orchid, so it must do whatever it takes to get the male bee's attention. So this is how they do it. Many orchids have evolved flowers to literally look like female bees in colour, shape, and size, but our early spider orchid fools invisibly. A spiked cocktail misleads the male bee into sex. Research in the 1990s identified a thrilling match in the chemical compounds emitted by both the early spider orchid ready to be pollinated and those of a female buffish mining bee ready to mate. That's when the early spider orchid strikes, in the heat of the moment when desire is blinding for the male bee. By the time he's realized the orchid's fraud, the deed has been done. The orchid is pollinated. Of all the senses, smell is generally regarded to hold the tightest bind to memory and emotion. A single whiff can catapult you backwards, sometimes across decades, to a specific moment. A hello, a goodbye, a win, a loss. Olfactory is also the impulse for the male bee. Of the 100 compounds emitted by the expectant orchid, up to 24 of them have matching receptors within the male bee. Reader, we are witnessing a premeditated event in watching the bee as he smells what he believes to be her. He wants her badly. He might even see this strange version of her, perhaps feel her. After all, studies suggest that visual and tactile deceptions may play more of a role in this hoax than previously thought. He moves closer, responding to this thirst trap in blind, possessive orchid mania. Thanks to the floral bouquet emitted by the orchid, including ingredients that match the compounds known to rev the male bee's sex drive or copulatory response if you're finding this all a bit much. Together, flower and pollinator turn and spin. He attempts to mate, he butts the flower in exhaustive sexual frenzy, searching for rhythm, and during this, one or both orchid pollinia might stick to his body or perhaps his head. If they do, they may get pulled from the flower as the bee withdraws. The pair break apart for a breath and return into hold as though rehearsed. But something is wrong. He cannot perform. He's been duped, Mike laughs, shaking his head as though after all these years he still cannot believe it. And the orchid gets exactly what she wants.
But I found it fascinating that you use this example as to show how climate change is affecting the populations of these spider orchids. And therefore, everything else is in the balance too, you know, the life of this bee. And is that because the seasons are changing and climate change is changing our seasons, and therefore the orchid isn't isn't
Yeah.
growing at the same time.
Yeah, so everything, I guess as you can infer from that passage, everything feels minutely timed. But the trouble with climate change is that it's changing our seasons, and they're kind of blurring between the lines that we have expected them to fall within. And so many of you may have heard of the term spring creep. So spring is creeping forward in the calendar, and I think since these orchids first started being studied in earnest, where climate change wasn't even a factor, it kind of slunk in as a sort of sub-character in the shadows, and then it became like the focus of this one study that I followed throughout the whole of that chapter. Spring is advanced by about a week, and the trouble is that the flower needs to be in flower before the male bee emerges, so that the male bee emerges, smells the lovely flower, thinks it's a female, boom, it all happens perfectly. But the trouble with spring creep is that rising temperatures are meaning that the female bee is now emerging from hibernation earlier. So in some cases, she's beating the flower to be the male bee's mate. I actually had to map all this out on Post-it notes because I was getting so confused about who's coming out first. But if the orchid isn't pollinated by the male bee because he gets the real deal with the female bee, if she comes out earlier than the flower, then the flower can't be pollinated and the population can crash. And so it's not that the early spider orchid is necessarily a keystone species and the world will collapse around it if they're not around anymore, but it's more a cautionary tale about what climate change is doing to these very ancient, finely tuned interactions.
And was that a central part of your book, to educate and to make people engage about climate change? And
I think so. I think writing a book is a huge undertaking, and climate change was a non-negotiable part of it. It has to be if you're going to be talking about the natural world. And writing a book also I kind of grapple with the feeling of it being quite a self-indulgent project in many ways, especially if you're the narrator, and I really don't want it to feel like a kind of my story. I'm simply the messenger for these stories, and I feel very privileged to be in that position. And so, climate change is absolutely, you can't look at any of these species and ignore climate change, because then you're not telling the truth.
a big question, did writing and researching this book, did it make you feel hopeful about climate change?
Yeah, I think so. I think goodness me, it made me realise how much we underestimate nature's resilience and aptitude and intelligence and adaptability. And, these relationships have survived millions of years of turbulence and other eras of climate change. And so this one is different because it's it's human-induced climate change. We've never had fossil fuel emissions in past eras and epochs, and so these are new challenges. But nature is adapting. But it's more, okay, well, if climate change is coming in as a new participant in these relationships, shall we say, in some cases it is literally severing parasite from host, but in other cases it's bringing new participants into the scene. And so what's that dynamic look like from a relationship point of view? So there's a lot of question marks. There's more questions than answers. So if you're searching for answers in this book, you're not really going to find any. But I think that's what keeps us curious about nature, is we don't need to know everything, but I think it's being introduced to its slightly darker, deeper happenings I find really exciting. And
do you think that your generation is clued in to the crisis and doing something about it? Because as a gardener, I do feel we're on the cusp of a change, a big change, and I feel hopeful about it, and I think more and more people, are engaging with it and doing something about it. But it all depends on your generation, really, and are people, can you see people being engaged and doing something about it?
Oh, totally. I think, lots of people. I'm a very glass half full person, and I think if you kind of open your eyes and look, you'll see actually there's lots of amazing things happening, big and small. I think what is really exciting at the moment is we're talking about it more than ever. I think I'm getting questions more than ever about it, and I think I'm, seeing those ripple effects happening is really cool, and life is more accessible than ever in many ways in terms of knowing what's going on through the internet, through social media, to the point where sometimes that noise is so deafening that it's hard to actually focus. But I think awareness and a sort of itchiness to do something. I've noticed, even just in the last year, we've had a year of really weird weather, and I think that has got people talking a lot and got people questioning, and I think that sense of unease is a very primal, bone-deep instinct of, okay, well, wow, we haven't had rain in a long time, and so that's our sort of mammalian switch turning on of we need to get some water, and how do we do that? What's actually going on? What's the wider picture? So there's definitely more conversations happening. I think I'd love to see there being more airtime on massive platforms and broadcast media having these conversations, and for it to attract as broad an audience as possible and not just be preaching to the choir. But I think we're getting there. I think it would be nice to feel a bit more led in that direction.
Another book in you, or any TV? I think you'd be brilliant on TV. Any plans for something in the future?
Well, I mean, I do miss the writing days, but as I mentioned earlier, I think writing a book, I would never undertake it again unless I felt like it really mattered and was going to have a purpose and a place, and hopefully I sort of try and view writing as an act of public service, and so if there was an idea that really blew me away, then I'd be interested in interrogating it. But honestly, I still feel like this book has its talons in me, so it's been really fun kind of getting stuck into the material again, and then getting emails from some of the experts I met saying, oh, I've discovered this new species, or oh, look at this video of this worm and they did something crazy. I'm like, oh my gosh, I love that you sent me this.
It will never end. You know
it will never end. Symbiosis is everywhere, and what's wonderful is to start hearing from readers as to, they've suddenly found themselves in a dark, literal wormhole on the internet looking at hairworms and stuff. I mean, it's really cool. For me, at least.
And I think if you're a gardener, then do read this book, because it just takes everything to the next level. It's amazing. And actually, I think that Sophie should write a book about soil and soil life next. Over to you.
It's a world in itself, isn't
but
it?
we've run out of time, I think. But does anyone have any questions in the audience?
Or concerns?
It's just a minute ago you were saying to Sophie about it's her generation with their awareness and understandings coming through. But I really think that it's important for people older who have more power to actually more facilitate the young people to get their ideas out there and to help them to make changes, because otherwise we're just saying, well, we created climate change, but it's up to you to fix it. I think that's so wrong. So,
I mean, I think probably the older generation can be a bit stuck in their ways, and they've done things very traditionally for forever. So being open-minded is so important, isn't it? And you're right, we have to lead that next generation.
Yes, thank you. I don't think I can add to that.
Hi there, thank you both for that talk. It's a bit of a random one, but what are your favourite go-to plants to grow at home?
Oh God, I'll be here for hours. Okay, well, thinking of something that's flowering at the moment, I am really into growing seed-grown dahlias. So everyone grows dahlias from tubers usually, but in the last couple of years I've got into growing them from seed, and it's so easy. They are the easiest thing to grow from seed, and they germinate really, really easily. The only thing is you do not know what you're going to get, but I love that, because then you've got that surprise, and you don't know what's coming, and you might make the next new amazing dahlia. So yeah, that's just one of the things. But I mean, I'm obsessed with plants, with all flowers. So yeah. One more question.
Hello, thank you for that. Enjoyed it very much. How are we going to make the younger people have a sense of fun? We tend to get a bit preachy. How do we get a more accessible way through to younger children and younger generation? We tend to be a bit preachy.
I think she's not preachy.
I know she's not.
But yes, I know what you mean.
I think that's a really good question and something that I try and keep at the forefront of my mind, because I can tell, I can basically, if I'm drafting like this and I've spent time on social media getting bogged down in the doom and gloom, and then I think, oh, I've got to write 500 words a day. Those 500 words are dull and boring, and I read it back and I think, oh, I was not in a good headspace there. If I've got headspace and I've tried to re-engage with my own sense of awe and wonder and playfulness, the writing not only comes more easily, but I think it reads in a more playful way. And I think in terms of, I think children are especially spongy in terms of absorbing information. And if they're exposed to lots of doom and gloom and negative information and news cycles and things, they will absorb that. And I would hate for that to influence their view of nature, because children's instinct is to see nature as absolutely incredible, amazing, the best thing you could possibly ever discover, and never ending. And so I think it's finding opportunities and supporting teachers and schools and those in positions of teaching to find room in the curriculum for play, outside, learning outside in all weathers, and getting hands dirty, and like Forest School, an incredible initiative that I think encourages children to retain a sense of play. And then I think communicators and authors, and there's tons of amazing children's books coming out now that are gently poking the climate narrative, but still in a fun way, with fun characters, making people laugh, I think has to be done. Because not only does that help you retain information better, makes you feel better, and you're going to think more clearly and do better work, I think, if you're in a better state of mind. So it's a huge question, and I think an ongoing conundrum, but I think playfulness is a secret weapon in trying to keep the energy up, really, in tackling these things.
And also having nature studies and botany and horticulture on the curriculum in schools, so important, because all the kids are just driven into these very academic subjects and then driven on to university. No apprenticeships and more practical thing. I think there's a lot we can do.
One more.
Hello. Not sure if you're aware. So we have two boys, very much into technology, as most children are these days. Not sure if you're aware, or just highlighting it really, the Roblox game, Grow a Garden, where children are actually playing and they're growing gardens virtually, planting seeds, growing them, harvesting, is that right? You probably know more about it than I do. They are growing gardens.
Okay, well, that's good. That is an example of a good...
on iPads and screens.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we've talked about it, haven't we? And we're hoping that eventually maybe, it might foster something later in life, that they do actually go out and engage with gardens and growing and nature. We'll have to see, won't we?
Oh, well, that's a really positive note to end on. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And go and buy Sophie's book.
And also Claire's book. We're both going to be going over to the book tent and scribbling in books right now, I think. So.
Yes, right now. Please show your appreciation for Sophie and Claire.